Hello, and welcome back to Human Evolution. Today, I would like to talk about the human influence on species and ecosystems. But in order to do that, the first thing we need to do is really understand how species interact in ecosystems. And there's some major interactions that we need to talk about. Really, you can divide interactions into two categories: antagonistic interactions, and these result in a negative outcome for one of the participants, and then there are mutualistic interactions, and that is where both species benefit. Now, having said this, some will argue that there are commensalistic relationships, which one species benefits and one species is unaffected. But in reality, you can't have two species interacting with each other and one be completely unaffected. There are just degrees as to how much that other species or other individual is affected, and in some cases it's minimal at best, and so that's kind of what falls into these commensalistic. But ultimately you have these negative impacts or these positive impacts, and so some of the big ones are going to be competition, right, predation, and mutualism, just in general. Okay, those are kind of the three big things that we'll be focusing on. Many of these relationships result in something called coevolution. Okay, and coevolution is a reciprocal change in the genetic competition. So we've been talking about selective pressures and selection and things like that, and how you can have certain traits, the genes for certain traits, the alleles for those particular traits, right, getting pushed more or less in the population. Yeah. In the case of coevolution, you have two or more species interacting with each other that are exerting pressures on each other, and they are evolving in response to each other. And so coevolution is a special case in an interaction between species where you have evolution of both species. Coevolution is not that one species has some trait and then another species evolves in relation to that. And a good example of that is going to be, say there are bears that climb up to get these plants that grow on trees, high up on trees, called bromeliads. And these bears climb up the tree. Well, the bromeliads just do what they do. They're specialized to grow in the tree, right? The bears have actually become more specialized to climb the trees to get the bromeliads. But the bromeliads do not change in response to the bears. The bears are changing in response to the bromeliads. So that is not coevolution, right? That's just a straight up predation relationship. Coevolution has to involve the species exerting pressures on each other. And an example of that would be, there is, here in the United States, there is a little newt that is toxic enough to kill 10 grown men, right? And the reason that it is this toxic is not because it needs to kill 10 grown men, right? But there is a snake that eats it, and that snake can metabolize the poison. So over generations, the newt have become more toxic as the snakes have become better at metabolizing the poison. And so you've had this escalation between the two species. And many, many, many species interactions are the result of coevolution, which is why I mention it. Okay, so that first one, the bromeliad and the bear, that's just natural selection. That's just straight up natural selection. Coevolution is based on these interactions and reciprocal changes. Okay, so the first really powerful motivator of evolution is competition. This is the major driving force for these changes that we see. And it boils down to this: only one species can fill a niche, otherwise there's going to be competition for it, right? And you're asking yourself, well, what is a niche? A niche is the sum total of an organism's or species' use of all of the resources around it. So it is all the food it eats, it's when it is food, becomes food, right? It's the water it uses, it's the interactions it has with other species, it's where it lives, it's the home it has, right? All of those things that you think about when you think about the life of a species. And the bottom line is this: there are limited resources. And so if you are trying to do the same things that another species is trying to do, there's going to be competition for those limited resources. So how do we alleviate competition? And the answer to that is specialization, right? Animals, plants, or whatever will start to specialize to exploit resources better, to outcompete another individual or another species. Okay, so only one is going to win. And this is actually called the law of competitive exclusion, by the way, that only one species can fill a niche at any given time. And there are two really big ways to eliminate competition or alleviate competition. And the first one is, you can still exploit the same resource, but you partition that resource. So some birds eat during the day, some birds eat at night. So owls and hawks both eat kind of the same things, right? They would be in the same niche. So if an owl eats a mouse and a hawk eats a rabbit, right? They're kind of in the same niche. Yeah, if they are working during the same time period. But since owls feed at night and hawks feed during the day, they can fill the same niche because they're doing it at different times, right? In some cases, you might alter the niche. So think about birds, right? Birds that eat the same seeds, some of the birds will eat off the ground. Some of the birds will eat in the lower levels of the tree. Some of the birds will eat towards the trunk. Some of the birds will eat out towards the outer branches of the tree. This is all a different location. It's a resource partitioning, yeah? Now, the other thing that happens is character displacement. This means that because there's variety, you can exploit something slightly different. This really quickly leads to speciation within a population, by the way. Think Darwin's finches. Remember those little finches that had bigger beaks could eat bigger seeds, and so they would do that. They're adapting to a new resource, and that would alleviate the competition between them and the original population. Okay, so just remember, a niche is the set of resources that can be used, and there's really two niches, right? There's the fundamental niche. This is ideal, like everything that you get if life is perfect. And then there's the realized niche. This is what you can actually use, and it is based on the resources available. This is what sets carrying capacity, and we've talked a little bit about carrying capacity. That's the maximum number of individuals that can live in any ecosystem, and it's based on the realized niches. All right, so there's two types of competition. There's interspecific competition, and this is between two species. Here you see a lion and a hyena. They compete for prey, right? It's a regular thing. No two organisms can occupy the same niche without competition. And more often than not, one of those species will eventually end up going extinct, right? Depending on how severe the competition is. Lions and hyenas have been fighting for a really long time. They'll continue to do so, but it really limits their population, and it limits the carrying capacity of those two species, right? But in many cases, one of them goes extinct, and I want to talk briefly about the War of the Squirrels. Yes, adorable, the American gray squirrel, our friend, we're used to it, right, hangs out here. But where it is not from is England, right? In England, they have, and you know, actually the whole area, right? They have the red squirrel, cute little red squirrel here, squirrel nutkin, right? Beatrix Potter squirrels, they're all red squirrels. They're slow. They don't reproduce quickly. They don't have protein-rich diets, right? They're not aggressive. They're kind of like the Model T of the squirrel world. The American squirrel, on the other hand, is the Ferrari of the squirrel world. They are fast. They are aggressive. They can eat like nobody's business. They can live anywhere, and they can eat pretty much anything. Not only do they eat a lot of it, but they eat everything. And they have protein in their diet, too, which gives them a little extra oomph, right? This is the original habitat of the red squirrel, all of this area here. But in the early 1900s, gray squirrels were brought in as a novelty item. a novelty animal, and they escaped. And so they set up they started to populate. And by 2000, they had taken over. They are such better competitors in this environment that really doesn't have a significant number of predators to keep that population down. And when they do, the red squirrels are the target because the gray squirrels are better at evading. They're really taking over. And so they're actually starting to take all sorts of actions to limit the gray squirrels in England, but it really probably is already too late for the red squirrel, who is probably going to go extinct in England in a relatively short period of time. Okay, so that was all about interspecific competition. But what about intraspecific competition? What about that competition among individuals within a species? All right, so when we talk about this, right, I'm first going to ask you a question. So we've thought about interspecific competition, but what would be an effective strategy for reducing intraspecific competition? Different ecological niches for juveniles and adults, eating prey before they're ripe for another species, rapid reproduction, establishing territories, or none of these. So if we're thinking about intraspecific competition being within the same species, we're talking about the same kinds of individuals. There may be some variety there, but ultimately we're really filling the same niche, and that's okay. Eating prey before they're ripe for another species, that's interspecific competition. Rapid reproduction would increase competition across the board for everybody, so that's never the answer for reducing competition. Establishing territories, actually you compete for territories, so that is just a form of competition. But think about frogs, right? Frogs start out as tadpoles. The reason that you have complex life cycles and they work is because you can have juveniles exploiting one set of resources, and so they're not actually competing with adults who have changed to deal with another set of resources, caterpillars and butterflies. They do different things, and this is a huge way to eliminate competition and to keep your population numbers higher, right? Intraspecific competition is very complicated in social species like monkeys and apes, and we're going to talk a little bit more about intraspecific interactions when we start talking more about primates. But needless to say, it's complicated because organisms that live in groups, right, these kind of quote higher level organisms that live in groups, we have on the one hand the need for the community, but on the other hand we have that intraspecific competition that can sometimes be violent. And so again, we'll talk about this more later on. Okay, so let's look at this. Certain night active moths and day active birds are specialized nectar feeders. How do these species coexist if they're using the same resource for food? So think about everything that you learned about competition. Is there enough nectar to supply both the birds and the moths? Eventually they will be able to exploit other resources and it won't matter. Both will migrate to a new area since they both eat nectar and they can't be in the same area together, or they don't actually compete because they feed at different times. Well, the niche is not going to expand. Okay, there's never enough nectar to supply both the birds and the moths at the same time. Maybe if you had direct competition, someone would migrate to a new area. Maybe not. But in this case, they actually don't compete because they feed at different times. This was an example of resource partitioning. Okay, let's switch to predation. Essentially, every organism on the planet is engaged in an evolutionary arms race. We are the products of a 4 billion year evolutionary war, right? And this is where you see coevolution really extensively, okay? And you get this escalation between the offensive abilities of predators and parasites, and the defensive capabilities of prey and host, right? So we're really talking about predation, and I've included the parasitism kind of thing, a parasite and its host, because there's a predation relationship there, even though it's symbiotic, okay? And again, like competition, this type of interaction often results in specialization. Okay, so what are some of the adaptations that predator and prey have that are really specialized for this interaction? Well, let's think about natural weapons, claws, right? Beaks, talons. And don't forget, our prey animals also can defend themselves. So some of these things work for either prey or predator. You want to be fast, you want to be agile, you want to be able to escape your, you want to be able to catch your prey, or you want to be able to escape your predator. Okay. On the flip side, you could also want to be really slow so nobody notices you. This is typically a prey strategy. Most of the time, it's not great if you're a predator to be super slow, because then your prey just wanders away. Okay. You could have armor like the roly-poly or the crab or the armadillo. The roly-poly and the armadillo can actually roll up because they're super flexible, so that adds to that as well. This is typically a prey strategy, and a modified version of armor is going to be spines, right? You certainly don't want to take a big old bite out of that. So there's a little bit combination of the natural weapons with the armor and plates. You could also be huge, right? This works really well for predators. Be big enough to eat anything, but by the same token, you might want to be too big to get eaten, right? So this is a predator-prey strategy. Okay. Now, some animals don't have large size, so they might inflate themselves, right? Like a pufferfish. So you're small most of the time because that's pretty energy efficient, but occasionally you can get really big. Also seen in mammals. The cat is a really good example of that. They fluff up and hunch up because they're trying to be bigger and scary. Okay. Now, another strategy for looking scary is to advertise the fact that you don't want to get eaten because you might have some sort of thing like a poison or bad taste. And so in coloration, we have aposematic coloration. This is a prey strategy. If you're a predator, you probably don't want to be seen. But if you're prey and you're poisonous, you might want to let people know so they don't eat you. On that whole, if you're a predator, you probably don't want to be seen. Now we're talking about camouflage. This is called cryptic coloration, and both predator and prey employ this, right? Here there is an animal right in the center of this photo that would be unnoticeable if it didn't move. This is a problem, by the way, with cryptic coloration. You have to be still for it to work. If you're moving, other animals can see you moving. But there's a little bunny right in there, and that agouti color blends really well. And then, of course, what if you live in an environment that changes? You might have seasonal coloration. In the summer and spring, you might be brown to match the environment. And when it snows, you turn white. Now, I'd like to say a disclaimer. This is an Arctic hare. This is actually not an Arctic hare. This is a jackrabbit. But I couldn't find a good picture of an Arctic hare that had its seasonal coloration, and it looks sort of colored like that. So disclaimer, this is not actually an Arctic hare, but it works for the demonstration. Okay. Now, you might want to blend into your environment by not just your color. You might want to actually look like something else, right? This is a walking stick, and this is a moth that's colored and shaped a little bit like this cluster. There's actually a moth in here too. So my challenge to you is to see if you can find the animal that is hidden in this picture, because it's in there. Okay? All right. Now, also, we can employ a little chemistry, right? Wouldn't it be great if you could neutralize your prey by having it poisoned? Then you can just go get it. That's exciting. By the same token, you might also want to employ some sort of chemical defense. That is your friend, not really, poison ivy, right? The chemical in poison ivy keeps it from getting eaten by herbivores. It's a deterrent to herbivory. Okay, so these are all some specializations that you might see. So does specialization guarantee success? It does not. That is false. Specialization does not guarantee success, right? This seems like this would be a great, successful big cat, right? Good claw, that's not a claw, that's a tooth. Good canines, right? Grabby and bitey. But that specialization can get totally out of control. This is a saber-toothed cat, right? And it got teeth so long that it actually became unable to hunt or eat properly, and so it went extinct because these teeth just kept getting longer and longer, and that turned out to be bad, right? So just because you're specialized doesn't mean that things are going to go well for you. And that could go really poorly for you when you start looking at the human influence, which is what we want to talk about now. Human influence, we put a lot of selected pressures, most of which are unintended, on other species. And there are really 5 big areas where we affect biodiversity, and that is habitat loss. We introduce non-native species. Our population is just really competitive, and we take up a lot of space and a lot of resources. We also like to pollute stuff, right? We don't like to, but we do pollute a lot of stuff. And then we actually overhunt, overharvest, right? We overexploit our environments. We take more than they can handle, right? Which is why there are hunting limits, for instance. Hunting actually turns out to be a positive thing in terms of keeping populations at good numbers for the space that they have. That's a really important function. Having said that, though, when you poach or you hunt out of season or you take too many animals, right? So poaching would be hunting out of season, illegally hunting, or taking too many animals. That disrupts the ecosystem, and so those quotas are really important. It's really important to follow the laws if you are a hunter, right? That falls in the overexploitation category. Okay, fishing, you need to get a fishing license. You can only fish certain size fish. You can only fish certain species. That helps us maintain these populations because we're putting all these other pressures on them, okay? But ultimately, what is the greatest threat to wild species populations? Is it habitat loss? Is it that we overhunt? Is it all those other species we keep bringing in? Or is it just like predation in general? The answer is habitat loss. The number one really big cause of loss of species is habitat loss. We degrade, we use, we destroy all kinds of habitats, and this causes the most problems. And this is how you get endangered species. Endangered species are plants and animals that are so rare that they're in danger of becoming extinct. The next level up from threatened species, or from endangered species, is threatened. Okay, this is they will become endangered in the foreseeable future. And then just above that is vulnerable. That means that they are susceptible to becoming threatened and then endangered. And if you're interested to know what species are endangered, I have some links in here that will give you U.S. endangered species and world endangered species. But look, here's a little photo gallery of 4 species that are endangered, which would be gorillas, orangutans, chimpanzees, and bonobos. Oh, all of our 4 cousins. Our activities have actually endangered our closest living relatives, and that's kind of an interesting and sad state. Yes? Okay, so what are the characteristics of endangered species? They're the guys that are super specialized. They're the guys that can't adapt well. They have small numbers of offspring. They are really adapted to stable communities, and so they don't do well with change, right? Things like that, okay? Those are the things that make one species more vulnerable than another, right? The Florida panther is a member of the cat family and has a population of fewer than 100 individuals. So this is limiting its genetic variation. So which inference based on this information is valid? So what I'm asking you is which of these statements would be true based on this information? These animals are easily able to adapt to the environment. Over time, these animals will be less likely to survive in a changing environment. These animals will begin to evolve rapidly. Over time, these animals will become more likely to be resistant to disease. Well, over time, these animals are actually going to become less likely to survive in a changing environment because they don't have the variation. That limited genetic variation is a real problem. Okay, that's a real problem because you don't have the gene pool. Think about the bottleneck effect or the founder effect. You don't have the gene pool. They're clearly not easily able to adapt to the environment because there are so few of them. It doesn't trigger evolution to become threatened, right? And if you have less variety, you're probably less likely to be resistant to disease because you don't have, all sorts of options. But that's a mutation thing, so who knows about that? Who knows at all? So on that note, let's follow up this idea of small populations with the whooping crane, which we have populations here at UT Southwestern. These guys are endangered. Their numbers were as low as 14 in 1939. So which is probably the greatest obstacle to recovering this species And they are recovering, but what's going to be their greatest obstacle? There are no nesting sites for adult birds. There's still hazards along their migratory routes, which was a huge problem for them. There's low genetic variation due to the small number of survivors in 1939. The use of chemicals, including DDT, reduces the number of hatchable eggs, or little planes fly into migrating birds. Well, there are hazards along their migratory routes. Nesting sites are hard to find. We don't actually use the egg-destroying chemicals the way that we used to, so that's good. Birds do fly into planes, all kinds of things like that. Having said that, though, those are all things that can be worked with. But what can't be compensated for is that 14 is a really small gene pool. Okay, and they have very limited genetic variation, and this is going to be the thing that's a problem. So by limiting numbers, we limit genetic variation, and that makes a species less able to cope with dynamic environments. Okay, now that is a salt cedar. That is Eladia, which you might have used in another bio class. That is an Asian carp, and this is a nutria. What do they all have in common? They are all not in their native habitat. These are all invasive species. We introduced all of these things into places they did not belong. They are non-native. Now, just as a question, true or false, all non-native species are dangerous and should be eradicated? This is actually false. Some non-native species can integrate into an ecosystem well. Some non-native species are not. We don't care about them because they're going to go, they can't survive in the new habitat anyway. It's only the ones that are invasive, okay? These are the ones that are able to get a foothold into an environment and start out-competing native species, and they start changing the ecosystem. To find out more about invasive species and who they are, I've given you 2 links to these, and they're in the PowerPoint that you can get on campus. Okay, but ultimately they negatively impact native species. They also can cause serious environmental and economic problems. And our big one, at least in Dallas, is the nutria. They are South American, and they are hugely destructive to rice and sugarcane crops, as well as streams, wetlands, Bachman Lake, right? All kinds of things. They destroy the habitat and the plants because they root and dig. They dig up all the plants and they just make it a big muddy mess. They are really destructive. Okay, another one you're familiar with, fire ants. They are also South American. They were imported accidentally. They damage crops because they eat crops. They displace native ants by killing them. They kill all sorts of food sources for wildlife. They actually kill baby livestock and any ground-dwelling wildlife they'll kill and eat. And they're a huge nuisance to humans, and some children have actually died from having multiple ant stings, especially if they're allergic to them. They cause, I think I read somewhere, they cause over $1 billion worth of damage here in Texas. Right, last year or something like that. I'll look it up. Ask me in class, but I'll look it up. But it's amazing, right, how much damage fire ants do. And then the other one I want to highlight real quick right now are the feral hogs. All over the South, there's a population here in Texas as well of somewhere probably around 6 to 7 million feral hogs. They are a hybrid between Russian boar, Eurasian boar, and domestic pigs. They are highly aggressive. They destroy crops the same way that nutria do. They actually dig everything up, but it's not just in wetlands. They destroy everything. They carry diseases that can be transmitted to humans. They destroy fences. They outcompete all sorts of species that are native. They're a real problem, and they get huge. They have rapid reproduction rates. So some of these things that made endangered species endangered, low reproductive rates, inability to adapt. On the flip side, if you have high reproductive rates, you have a high ability to adapt, you have no native predators, then you're likely to be successful as an invasive species. So the characteristics that make things endangered The opposites of those are the things that make invasive species invasive. Yeah. So they're kind of the opposite side of the spectrum. So, which of the following are common sources of the introduction of non-native species? So I said that we introduce them a lot. How does that happen? Decoration, pets, hitchhiking, to benefit our ecosystem and property, or at least we think they will, or all of these? It is actually all of these, right? We bring in all sorts of non-native plants for landscaping. We like exotic pets, right? Boa constrictors and stuff like that. Sometimes they just ride along, right? Fire ants came in cargo. Spiders from South America have come with bananas, right? Stuff like that. Sometimes we do it because we think it's going to be beneficial. Like in the South, in the 30s, we planted all sorts of kudzu. It's a climbing vine from Japan, to prevent erosion, and it turned out that that was highly invasive. Our native herbivores like deer and stuff don't eat it, and it outcompetes everything. It's almost impossible to get rid of. So the whole South is being covered with kudzu. So we do all of these things, and it turns out to be a real problem. Which of the following is not a reason why invasive species are successful in an ecosystem? No natural predators, high biotic potential, specialized niche, or they have the ability to live in a variety of habitats? Well, they have no natural predators, so there's nothing to keep their population in check. They do have lots of offspring, that's high biotic potential, and they are generalists. They can pretty much eat lots of different things. They have wide ranges of tolerance, so they can move around. They are usually not specializers. So you have two kind of categories of animals. You have specialists and you have generalists. Specialists are like hummingbirds. Yeah, generalists are like raccoons. They eat everything. So your generalists, your high reproductive rate, these guys are a high, wide range of tolerance. They can become invasive easily. The opposite of that, they'll have a tendency to become endangered. All right, that is a lot of information in a short period of time. I mean, sort of short, it's 30 minutes. Please ask questions when you come to class next time, and thanks for listening. I will see you in class.